This photo comes from one of the most dense places on the planet, Mexico City, Mexico. It is probably more photogenic than some of the other megacities that I could use. Tokyo being another obvious example, New York, Lagos, Delhi. There's more and more of these urban centers that are drawing more and more people in. We're not talking about millions of people now, but tens of millions of people. I've spent time living in both big cities and small areas where there are hardly any people in it. And the urban centers that are drawing more and more people are faced with unique challenges when you have a huge move of humanity moving within countries from more rural areas to urban areas. Next week, we're going to be talking about the effect of people moving from one country to the next, but I thought I would spend some time looking at the importance of population flows within countries. We've touched on the importance of just the sheer number of people relying on a certain resource base. We've looked at how different population groups, specifically young men, are at different systematic risk of being unemployed, using political violence, and therefore have often been targeted for different forms of anti-violence campaigns. After conflict demobilization programs are often geared towards young men and less towards other people that might have been victims or drawn up in the conflict. But I thought I would spend some time now talking about urbanization as a unique challenge for states to be able to manage their own countries, as well as the possibilities of systematically different risk of conflict. Okay, but before I do that, I got so into my discussion of youth bulges and conflict, I forgot to mention my lecture question number 2. It was in my notes, but it wasn't. I didn't have a dedicated slide, so here's the dedicated slide. So in the youth bulges section, we talked about. I'm sitting here in a room by myself. I'm talking at you, but I was talking about how the Erdal piece argues for more interactive relationship between youth bulges and other socio and economic factors, similar to the climate change and environmental factors from last week. And so I wanted to get your opinion about what other factors might intersect with larger populations of young people and how that might drive conflict. Is there something else that the literature is missing? My supervisor, Pat Regan, when he was doing his dissertation, he was looking at militarization of certain societies, and he went to toy stores in the place where he was doing research and counted the number of military toys that were being sold in different toy stores as a way to kind of gauge how militarized a country was. So that's kind of an off-the-wall kind of thing. A couple of weeks ago, or last week, we were talking about how hotter temperatures make people more violent, and I include an example of the fact that car honking goes up in warmer weather, at least in the Phoenix area that they did the study. So is there anything else you can think of that academic researchers have missed? I'd be interested to hear your perspective. Some interactive relationship. I don't know. I mean, back in the 80s and 90s, there was a discussion about how video games could make people more violent. Al Gore was quite worried about that, and Tipper Gore, his wife, that seems to have gone by the wayside. Is there anything else that the youth population might end up leading to conflict? So yeah, leave your brief answer on Waddle. I look forward to reading your responses. But let's get back into urbanization. So people moving from small areas to big areas. In speaking to students in the workshops over the last couple of weeks, I've seen that a number of you come from rural areas and have migrated, or at least before the pandemic, to Canberra, relatively urban area. And this kind of trajectory, moving for education, for job opportunities, for family, is something that's playing out all over the world. And the world reached a tipping point just a little over a decade ago, in which you now have more people living in urban areas than you do in rural areas. First time in history this has happened. So right now, as of the last UN report that I could find, as of 2014, 54% of people are living in urban areas. That's 3.9 billion, while 3.4 billion people are living in rural areas. If there's one thing I've tried to reiterate in this class, is that these kind of aggregate trends can mask a lot of variation, both within regions as well as within countries themselves. So you see different geographic regions within the world have different levels of urbanization. The region with the highest is North America with 82%. Africa the lowest at 40%. You have Asia with 48%, Europe 73%, Latin America and the Caribbean slightly lower, and North America with 80%. So you have like over a 40 percentage point discrepancy between North America and sub-Saharan Africa. So you would think that Africa has been relatively static in this high-level rural population. In the Burundi case, over 90% of people are living in rural areas and relying on agricultural production, but that masks in some ways the speed of the change that's happening. And the aggregate level, you can see that inflection point was around between 2005 and 2010. Then more people are living in urban areas than in rural at a macro level, global level. And if you disaggregate, you see differences by region. North America is creeping up, but not as fast as in Asia. Oceania has been relatively flat, but that 40% in Africa really is a dramatic increase from where the continent was just at the turn of the century, when there was 30%. So you have 10% move from rural areas to the city just in a decade, which is quite a remarkable change. Even Europe, you have this movement as well. And you can look at it. Oh, where am I? Break it down into where the urban population is by country. There's a whole lot of different ways of trying to visualize the size and the scale of this increase in urban population. You see China and India just by the pure sheer numbers of people within the countries. The absolute numbers are also some of the largest. But Nigeria, the most populous country in Africa, also has had a huge increase in urbanization, moving from the countryside to the city. Indonesia, US, Pakistan, and DRC are the other large ones. So you see relatively small number of countries can explain over half of the urban population movement around the world. So different countries are urbanizing at different speeds. How might urbanization lead to conflict? This is one of those theoretical questions you could frame an entire research paper around, right? And it is, let's see, Erdal, I think he had that, his fifth hypothesis was that urbanization has a positive interactive effect with youth bulges. And so younger people are less likely to have some of those ties. People with larger families, maybe a couple of the family members would move for greater job opportunities. In Nepal, I remember hearing a story that you can tell which families had family members living in the Middle East or in India, working abroad, because they were the ones that could have the metal roofs, that they had the funds that were being sent home with remittances. Um, but so young people are more likely to move. They might be less subject to oversight from their family, might be more easily drawn into conflict. When I think of urban areas, or when you might think of urban areas, you're probably less likely to think of violence. One of the more influential movies that I saw growing up that kind of sparked my interest in political violence was the Battle of Algiers, an old movie, 60s, I want to say, in which you have people fighting the French occupation in Algeria, and there was a lot of urban fighting there. And Urban areas are both dense and it's easier to control or easier to get a sense of where everyone is in an age in which you have CCTV and facial recognition technology more widespread. You're at a different level of governmental information and control. But even going back decades, governments are more likely to have sources, be able to monitor what's going on in urban areas. However, it's also easier to meet like minded people and to organize to be able to fight. From a scarcity standpoint, environmental factors are a huge challenge in in urban areas. I remember in Nairobi, the Kibera slums on the outskirts of Nairobi were absolutely huge, and a lot of areas people are cropping up that in areas that they're squatting or they don't have formal rights to the land, and they don't, as a result, have the infrastructure to be able to deal with a huge influx of people. And it can lead to quite noxious conditions where you don't have access to clean water, to adequate sewerage treatment, and that could lead to a lot of negative health issues as well as scarcity in trying to get resources. Um, However, that can also lead to inadequate job opportunities. People can often, in some countries, there's a huge amount of informal sector employment, people having to scrape a living by selling what they can, picking up work where they can. And often the job opportunities don't match the number of people that are there to actually work. So those high job unemployment numbers that I mentioned in Spain and Greece and other countries, by and large, a lot of that youth unemployment is in urban centers. Um, and yeah, I also mentioned the social and cultural change might also reduce the upper opportunity cost actually engaging in violence. But this is a much larger topic, and I don't think the literature is quite there where it needs to be to try to understand urbanization and conflict. Conflict studies in general have moved towards a disaggregation of conflict from the national level to the subnational level. We saw that with the environmental readings last week, rainfall studies from a couple of weeks earlier. But I don't think people really have grasped the way the urban geography is also important. The infrastructure. There's some really cool open sourced OpenStreetMap data looking at roads and infrastructure, how long it takes people to get around, and people break it out into the rural and the urban areas, but they haven't really looked at more detail in urban areas. And I think that this is a really interesting area for future research for us academics, but also for dissertation or honors projects to try to get a better grasp about how urban areas are organized, which groups are gravitated towards different areas. I had a friend of mine who's at NYU Abu Dhabi who wrote a really cool paper about the ethnic violence in Kenya after the 2007 election, and he looked at names which are ethnically linked in Kenya to quite a high extent. He looked at the distribution of people in urban and rural areas before the violence and then after the violence, looking at voter rolls, and he saw a gradual homogenization of different areas within the urban centers. That because of the violence, um, um, people that had been integrated and living in quite close proximity to each other after the violence, they kind of self segregated into different different geographical areas, and he was arguing that this could increase the risk of future conflict as peoples grew more separate. Iraq would be another example of this. After the violence from 2003 afterwards, you saw people moving within the country to areas in which there were more religious and the Shia, the Sunnis, and the Kurds kind of moved to their areas in which there was a majority, and that could lead to population movements. So you can kind of see how we've talked about urbanization leading to conflict, but you also have to think about the reciprocal relationship and possible endogeneity that conflict can actually lead towards more urbanization as people flee areas in which the government doesn't have control or move from areas where it's harder to earn a living to urban areas where there could be more of an opportunity. So a couple of initial trends that linked population and urbanization to conflict. You can see this in the in Homer Dixon's graph diagram that you could think of migration or expulsion. We're going to talk about the Zukov article and population resettlement next week because I think it ties more in the population movement week. But migration could have could lead to social effects that could lead to ethnic conflicts, or it could weaken states as governments have more people to take care of, more infrastructure to build. I don't know about you, but I was amazed where I was living in Belconnen that it took like 2 years to double a road due to the increased population density. It's can take quite long for states to adapt, even in developed countries. So I'm going to end this section with my third lecture question. Urbanization makes it easier for people with grievances to coordinate and act on their grievances, as I mentioned, but also easier for governments to provide services and control their population. Would you argue that urbanization is an important driver for conflict? And linking it to the lecture question 2, do you think that there's a possible interactive effect with urbanization that could possibly lead to conflict? So that is the third lecture question, and that leads me to the Gaza case study. I tried to think of a case where you had an intensely urban population, quite high population density, political uncertainty, and a history of conflict, and one in which the population dynamics have been recognized by both policymakers and academics as being a potential driver for future instability. So let's take a break, and you can answer your election question 3, and we'll get back into the Gaza case study, which is the last major section for today.